The night the mother slipped away, the world felt wrong in its silence. Her breathing had been shallow for days, each exhale weaker than the last, like a candle flickering against the pull of darkness. When the end came, it was not with thunder, but with a stillness so heavy the air itself seemed to mourn. 8 tiny bodies pressed against her, blind and helpless, still seeking warmth from a chest that no longer rose. Their whimpers cut through the room like glass, thin, desperate cries that no human hand could fully answer. I remember standing there frozen, the weight of loss pressing into me with the smell of damp hay, the cold metal of the kennel door against my palm. My heart raced between grief and panic. How could these lives, fragile, trembling, wet with milk that would never come again, survive without her? That's when our Doberman Titan padded forward. He stood tall and alert, his body casting a shadow over the tiny orphans. His eyes flicked from them to me, searching, steady, almost asking permission. I had seen loyalty in dogs before, but in that moment I saw something closer to destiny. The kennel smelled faintly of milk and damp hay, the kind of smell that clings to the air long after the life that made it has gone. The mother lay curled in the corner, her chest motionless, her once gentle eyes closed forever. A silence pressed down on me, so dense it drowned out even the ticking of the old wall clock. The only sound that remained was the chorus of 8 fragile cries, squeaks and whimpers that pierced like needles into my chest. I knelt beside her, my hand hovering over her fur, afraid to touch, afraid that the stillness would feel too final beneath my fingertips. My throat tightened, my breath catching in a tremor I couldn't control. It wasn't just the loss of her, it was the terrible truth of the tiny lives she left behind. Their bodies pressed against her belly, searching for milk that would never come. One tried to nuzzle deeper, desperate, its little head butting against her ribs. Another squealed, louder, sharp enough to make my eyes sting with tears. I whispered something I didn't fully hear myself say. A prayer, an apology, words that dissolved into the thick air of grief. My heart raced with the panic of helplessness. I could bottle feed, yes, I could try. But nothing could replace the warmth, the heartbeat, the instinctive comfort of their mother's presence. The puppies shifted, huddled closer together, their tiny bodies trembling like autumn leaves in a restless wind. The weight of their need pressed down heavier than grief itself. I felt like the world had just placed a burden in my arms I wasn't strong enough to carry. And then I felt it, the quiet, steady presence at my back. Titan. He had been watching from the shadows, silent, his ears pricked, his tall frame filling the doorway. His eyes weren't frantic like mine. They were steady, deliberate, as if he had already accepted something I had yet to understand. He stepped forward slowly, paws making no sound against the cold cement floor. His head lowered, his breath deep and warm as he leaned toward the wriggling pile of life that called out for a mother who was no longer there. I held my breath, half afraid, half hopeful. And then, so gently it broke me, Titan lowered his nose and nudged the smallest pup closer to his chest. At first, I thought it was curiosity. Titan lowering his head, sniffing the air heavy with milk that would never be drunk. But the moment stretched longer than it should have. His body shifted closer, his chest pressing against the cool cement as he lay down, as though to make himself smaller, less threatening to the tiny creatures at his paws. The puppies, blind and desperate, sensed the heat of his body. They began crawling toward him in shaky bursts, their tiny claws scratching against the floor. One by one, they bumped into his legs, into the dark silk of his coat, and Titan didn't flinch. He held perfectly still, his breath slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on them like a sentinel. Then, hesitant at first, almost clumsy, he lowered his head until his muzzle brushed one of their fragile bellies. A soft whimper rose from the pup, but it wasn't fear. It was recognition. I stood frozen, my heart clenched in my throat. Dobermans had a reputation, sharp, protective, sometimes feared for their intensity. Titan was all of that and more, but I had never seen him like this. His movements weren't fierce, they were reverent. He began to lick them, short, careful strokes, the way a mother dog would clean her newborns. His massive frame became a shield, curving around them, a wall of warmth in the cold absence of the mother they had lost. Something broke open inside me watching it. The grief, the panic, the sense of inadequacy, all of it tangled with the sight of Titan becoming what nature had not intended, but what the moment demanded. He was filling the silence, answering the cries in a language older than mine. The night deepened. I set out bottles, warmed milk, syringes. The feeding began, a clumsy, exhausting ritual that would soon become the rhythm of my life. But through it all, Titan stayed. He lay beside me as I held each fragile body, watched me carefully as I pressed a rubber nipple against their tiny mouths. He would nose at them gently when one grew too weak to latch, as if reminding them that life was still worth clinging to. And when my hands trembled with fatigue, when my chest ached from the endless cycle of feeding and cleaning and praying, Titan simply stayed. His presence was not loud or demanding. It was a steady hum in the background of chaos. He was not just a dog in that moment. He was a promise. On the third night, I woke to the sound of faint cries and padded barefoot into the room. Moonlight spilled in thin beams across the floor. What I saw stopped me cold. Titan had arranged himself around the pile of sleeping pups. His body curved protectively, his nose resting just above their twitching bodies, his breath keeping them warm. One tiny pup had crawled up onto his paw and fallen asleep against the smooth muscle of his leg, as if it had always belonged there. The sight was so tender, so unlikely, that I felt my throat burn with tears again. In that moment, grief loosened its grip. Hope slipped in through the cracks. Titan wasn't just watching over them. He was stepping into the space their mother left behind, and the puppies, without knowing, were beginning to accept him as their new world. The days blurred together in a haze of sleepless hours and milk-stained blankets. Morning no longer arrived with sunrise. It arrived when the last pup was fed, and I allowed myself the mercy of an hour's rest. Their cries were my alarm clock, their hunger my schedule, their survival my only priority. The world outside, the traffic, the chatter of neighbors, the steady beat of ordinary life, faded into a dull hum behind the closed doors of that room. Inside, time was measured in ounces of formula and the fragile rise and fall of tiny chests. Titan rarely left my side. At first I thought his devotion was temporary, a curiosity that would fade. But the longer the days stretched, the more his loyalty deepened into something unshakable. He moved with me as if tethered by an invisible thread. When I carried a pup in my hands, his eyes followed every step. When I sat cross-legged on the floor with bottles lined before me, he curled his body protectively around us, forming a circle of warmth and silence. The pups grew used to his presence. In the beginning they crawled clumsily, their bodies so small I feared my breath alone might crush them. They sought the heat of his belly, pressing against him as though he were their mother. He accepted their weight without flinching, adjusting only to nudge one closer when it drifted too far from the huddle. At night, when exhaustion pressed heavy on my eyelids, I sometimes found myself relying on him more than I dared admit. If I dozed off mid-feeding, Titan would nudge my arm gently, a silent reminder that one of them still needed me. The bond that formed between him and the puppies was not instinct as the world understood it. It was choice. He could have stayed distant, could have dismissed them as not his responsibility. Instead, he leaned into the role with a seriousness that humbled me. He cleaned them with careful licks, his massive tongue dwarfing their tiny frames, yet never once causing harm. When one squeaked louder than the rest, he lowered his head, ears twitching, as if listening for some message only he could understand. I remember one night in particular. The storm outside rattled the windows, wind howling like an animal in pain. Rain hammered against the roof, each drop a drumbeat in the darkness. I sat hunched over, cradling the smallest pup in my hands. She was weak, always struggling, always behind her siblings in weight and strength. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, her tiny chest fluttering like a trapped moth. Fear gripped me, cold and merciless. I whispered to her, begged her not to give up. Titan moved closer. He pressed his nose against her fragile body, his warm breath washing over her like a lifeline. Then, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, he began to nuzzle her, licking her gently until her tiny legs twitched. I watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the pup let out a faint cry. A sound so small yet so victorious it broke me open inside. I buried my face in Titan's fur, tears wetting his coat, whispering thank yous I couldn't fully put into words. The storm raged on, but inside that room, something shifted. Survival was no longer a fight I carried alone. It was a shared burden, a covenant formed between human and dog. Titan had become more than my companion. He was my partner in grief, in hope, in the delicate work of keeping life alive. As days turned into weeks, the puppies began to change. Their eyes cracked open, milky and uncertain, catching slivers of light for the first time. Their paws stumbled forward, clumsy steps that carried them into new corners of the world. Their voices grew stronger. their cries no longer frail but demanding. And always Titan was there, steady as stone, guiding them in his quiet way. He tolerated their tiny teeth tugging at his ears, their paws scrambling across his back, their clumsy attempts to climb him as if he were both mountain and mother. Sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, I would sit back and watch them all together, 8 little bodies crawling over the giant frame of the Doberman who had chosen to love them. The image filled me with a kind of peace I hadn't known since their mother passed. It was as if life, cruel in its sudden theft, had offered back a small miracle in return. And as the weeks went on, I realized something else. The pups weren't the only ones learning to breathe again. I was too. It began with a sound so small I almost missed it. A faint rattle in the chest of the smallest pup. At first I told myself it was nothing, just the ordinary uneven breath of a newborn still finding rhythm. But the sound deepened, a wetness in every inhale, a cough so tiny it shouldn't have been frightening. And yet it struck fear into my bones. I knew what it could mean. Puppies this young had no margin for error. Illness could sweep through them like fire through dry grass, taking life before you had the chance to fight back. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the sick pup nestled in my palms, and listened. Her body trembled with effort, her mouth opening in weak gasps. Around me, the other pups squirmed and squeaked, hungry and restless, but my focus narrowed to the fragile life I held. My breath grew shallow, as if I were trying not to take more than she could. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, the world pressing down on us both. Titan knew something was wrong. He had been lying near the litter, but the moment the pup coughed, he lifted his head sharply. His ears pricked, his eyes locked on her, his body alert in a way that spoke of urgency. Slowly, deliberately, he approached me, lowering his massive frame until his nose brushed against her tiny body. He sniffed, then whined softly. A sound I had never heard from him before, a note of fear threaded through his usually steady presence. I tried everything I could. Warmth, hydration, careful feeding in drops too small to measure. My hands shook as I worked, exhaustion gnawing at me, hope and despair warring with every shallow breath she took. Titan never left. He positioned himself against my side, his body heat radiating through me like a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this vigil. He licked her gently, as if his touch could coax strength back into her trembling limbs. When her breathing faltered, his head jerked, his eyes wide, his chest rising in fast bursts as though he could breathe enough for both of them. Hours stretched like days. The rain had stopped outside, but the silence that replaced it felt even heavier. I paced the floor with her cradled against me, whispering promises she could never understand, my voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. Titan followed each step, his claws clicking softly against the floor, his gaze fixed on the pup with a desperation that mirrored my own. At one point, I sank to the ground, my strength finally crumbling. I buried my face in my hands, tears hot against my palms. "I can't lose her," I whispered into the darkness. "I can't." Titan pressed against me then, his head nudging under my arm until his muzzle rested beside the pup in my hands. He stayed there, unmoving, his steady presence anchoring me to the ground. In that moment, the lines between species, between instinct and choice, blurred. We were simply two beings clinging to the same fragile hope. The night dragged on. Her breathing slowed, stuttered, then rallied, only to weaken again. Each time she faltered, my chest tightened, bracing for the silence that might follow. But each time, somehow, she clawed her way back, her tiny body refusing to surrender. And always Titan was there, licking, nudging, refusing to let the darkness swallow her without a fight. By dawn, the first faint threads of light crept through the window, painting the room in pale gold. The sick pup was still alive. Her breaths were shallow, uneven, but they came. Relief washed through me in waves, so sharp it left me trembling. I looked down at her, then at Titan, who hadn't closed his eyes once through the long hours of night. His gaze met mine, steady, unflinching, as though he had known all along that she would make it. That morning I carried her outside for the first time since the illness began. The world was damp, the earth smelling of rain and new beginnings. Birds sang from the trees, their notes piercing and bright. Titan walked beside me, his head low, his stride careful. I lowered her into the soft grass, watching as she shifted, stretched and, weakly but determined, crawled forward. She was not healed, not yet, but she was alive. And as I watched Titan lie beside her, his massive frame dwarfing her fragile body, I realized something profound. Life is unbearably heavy at times, so fragile it can break beneath the slightest strain. But love in its purest form carries weight too. It steadies, protects, refuses to let go. That night, Titan had carried the weight of life itself, holding her in a way I never could have alone. In that moment, I understood, these puppies were no longer just mine to save. They were ours. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow unfurling of spring. Each day carried with it a small miracle, a stronger cry, a steadier step, eyes opening wider to the world that once seemed too vast for such fragile bodies. The sick pup, the one whose life we had clung to with desperate hands and Titan's relentless devotion, began to gain strength. Her cough softened, her chest grew fuller with each breath, and one morning, I woke to find her clambering over her siblings, her tiny bark sharper, louder than any before. I laughed and cried in the same breath, the sound carrying through the room like sunlight. Titan's role never faded. If anything, it grew deeper, more intricate, as the pups grew bolder. They learned to climb his legs as though he were a mountain, tugging at his ears with their sharp little teeth, tumbling over his massive paws as if they were playgrounds. And he let them. A dog bred for power, for protection, for sharpness. He transformed into something softer, something tender because of them. He bore their chaos with patience, his eyes glimmering with something I can only call pride. But his watchfulness never wavered. He guarded them even in play, his gaze sweeping the room whenever they scattered too far. If one whimpered, he was there before me, lowering his head until the pup pressed against him for reassurance. At night, when exhaustion pulled me into uneasy dreams, I would wake to find Titan curled among them, his frame a fortress around their tiny bodies. They slept with their bellies pressed to his warmth, their small breaths rising and falling in time with his. I often caught myself staring at the scene, unable to move, unable to speak. Grief for their mother still lived inside me, a tender ache that would never fully vanish. But what Titan had given them, what he had given me, was more than survival. It was a rewriting of the story, a reminder that family is not defined by blood alone, but by love, by choice, by the fierce act of showing up when the world feels broken. There was one evening that crystallized this truth in me forever. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet. The pups, now stronger, wobbled across the grass outside, their little paws leaving faint imprints in the soft earth. I sat on the porch, watching them explore with a mixture of pride and awe. Titan stood among them, tall and commanding, yet gentle as he nudged them away from the garden's thorny edges. The smallest pup, the one who had almost slipped away, paused and turned back toward him. She stumbled, then pressed herself against his leg, tilting her head upward as though she recognized him not just as guardian, but as something more. Titan lowered his head until his muzzle touched hers, a quiet communion that stilled the world around us. In that moment, I saw not what had been lost, but what had been found. The ache of the mother's absence would never fully leave, but in its place had grown something extraordinary. A Doberman had stepped into an impossible role, and in doing so, had shown me the resilience of love. As twilight deepened, the pups gathered around him, their tiny bodies circling his massive frame like planets around a sun. He lay down among them, folding himself into their chaos, their warmth, their trust. And as the stars blinked into the sky above, I realized that what had once felt like tragedy had become something else entirely. It had become a family, unorthodox, imperfect, yet whole in its own miraculous way. And in that stillness, watching Titan breathe among the lives he had saved, I felt peace settle in my chest. For the first time since that night of silence, I knew we had not just survived, we had been transformed. The air was cool, the earth still damp from the last rain, and the puppies slept with their tiny bodies pressed into the rhythm of his heartbeat. And there, in the hush of nightfall, I understood the truth I would carry with me forever. Sometimes love rewrites the story we thought we were living. And sometimes, when the mother is gone, the protector becomes the parent. The night the mother slipped away, the world felt wrong in its silence. Her breathing had been shallow for days, each exhale weaker than the last, like a candle flickering against the pull of darkness. When the end came, it was not with thunder but with a stillness so heavy the air itself seemed to mourn. 8 tiny bodies pressed against her, blind and helpless, still seeking warmth from a chest that no longer rose. Their whimpers cut through the room like glass, thin, desperate cries that no human hand could fully answer. I remember standing there frozen, the weight of loss pressing into me with the smell of damp hay, the cold metal of the kennel door against my palm. My heart raced between grief and panic. How could these lives, fragile, trembling, wet with milk that would never come again, survive without her? The puppies shifted, huddled closer together, their tiny bodies trembling like autumn leaves in a restless wind. The weight of their need pressed down heavier than grief itself. I felt like the world had just placed a burden in my arms I wasn't strong enough to carry. And then I felt it, the quiet, steady presence at my back. Teton. He had been watching from the shadows, silent, his ears pricked, his tall frame filling the doorway. His eyes weren't frantic like mine. They were steady, deliberate, as if he had already accepted something I had yet to understand. He stepped forward slowly, paws making no sound against the cold cement floor. His head lowered, his breath deep and warm as he leaned toward the wriggling pile of life that called out for a mother who was no longer there. I held my breath, half afraid, half hopeful, and then, so gently it broke me, Titan lowered his nose and nudged the smallest pup closer to his chest. At first I thought it was curiosity, but as the minutes stretched, it became clear it was something else. He didn't turn away when their bodies pressed against him. Instead, he lowered himself to the ground, curling until his frame became a wall of warmth, until the whimpering softened under the sound of his heartbeat. The pups, blind and desperate, crawled toward him, bumping into the silk of his coat. He stayed still, as if he knew the slightest sudden movement might shatter their fragile trust. Then, with a patience so unexpected it made my chest ache, he began to lick them. Short, careful strokes, the kind a mother would give. That night the air in the room changed. The silence that had felt suffocating gave way to a rhythm, the soft cries of newborns, the steady breath of a Doberman who had stepped into the impossible. I sat with them until dawn, bottle, feeding one after the other, Titan's eyes following every motion. And when my hands trembled with exhaustion, he nudged me softly, as if reminding me not to give up. The days that followed blurred into one another, each measured in ounces of formula, each night broken by cries that pierced my sleep. But through it all, Titan remained my shadow. He lay curled around the pups while I washed bottles, watched intently as I fed them, and pressed his nose against their bellies as though checking each heartbeat. He didn't just guard them, he guided them. When one grew too restless, he nudged it back into the huddle. When another whimpered, he licked it gently until it quieted. The smallest pup worried me most. Her chest rattled with every breath, her body weaker than the others. More than once, I feared she wouldn't survive the night. I remember one storm in particular, rain hammering against the roof, lightning splitting the sky. I sat cradling her, tears streaming as her breaths faltered, my whispers little more than broken pleas. Titan pressed close, his muzzle touching her fragile body, licking her with slow determination. And in the darkness, I swore her breathing steadied, not because of me, but because of him. Hours bled into dawn, and when the storm finally eased, she was still alive. Her survival felt like a miracle carved out of sheer will, Titan's devotion stitched into every fragile breath she took. Weeks passed. Eyes opened, paws found clumsy steps, cries turned into barks. Titan, once their guardian, became their playground. They climbed his legs, tugged at his ears, tumbled across his back. He accepted it all with a patience that defied everything I thought I knew about him. Fierce by nature, he had turned gentle, his sharpness melted into devotion. I often caught myself staring at the sight of them all together. 8 small bodies orbiting the towering frame of the Doberman who had chosen to love them. Grief for their mother still lived in me, but it no longer consumed. It had been transformed by the bond I witnessed daily, the rewriting of family, not by blood, but by love. There was one evening I will never forget. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with amber fire. The pups stumbled through the grass, chasing shadows and each other. Titan stood among them, tall and commanding, nudging them gently when they wandered too far. The smallest one, the fighter, paused and pressed against his leg, looking up with eyes that had only just opened to the world. Titan lowered his head, touching his muzzle to hers. The world stilled. In that single moment, I saw it all. The loss, the survival, the transformation. I saw the truth of what we had built in the wake of tragedy. Titan was no longer just my dog, he was a father, a guardian, a savior written into their story by choice, not fate. That night, as stars began to prick the sky, I watched them all curl together in the grass, Titan's body a fortress around them. The sound of their breathing rose and fell in unison, tiny chests pressed against the rhythm of his heart. And in that stillness, I understood something I will carry forever. Sometimes life tears us apart. But sometimes in the breaking it offers us something we never expected, a family rewritten. The weeks turned into months, and the fragile weight of survival slowly gave way to the unsteady joy of growth. The pups, once small enough to fit into the palm of my hand, grew bolder with every sunrise. Their legs wobbled at first, clumsy steps that ended in tumbles. But soon the ground itself seemed too small for their energy. They wrestled in the grass, nipped at each other's ears, chased the shadows of birds overhead. And always, at the edge of it all, Titan stood, watching, waiting, guiding. I began to see a rhythm forming, a silent language that belonged only to them. A pup would wander too far, curiosity pulling it toward the fence line, and Titan would cut it off with a single step, his body forming a wall that turned exploration back into safety. When two grew too rough in their play, his low rumble was enough to make them scatter, only to tumble back seconds later with softer intent. What amazed me most was the way they looked at him. Even before their eyes had fully opened, they seemed to recognize something in him. Something beyond instinct, beyond species. They did not see a guard dog with sharp teeth and a proud stance. They saw safety. They saw home. And Titan, for all his strength, seemed to see himself reflected in them. There were moments, quiet ones, that caught me off guard. Late nights when the house was still, I'd find Titan lying in the corner of the living room, his frame curled protectively around the smallest pup. She was always closest to him, the fighter who had battled through weak lungs and stormy nights. She would press her tiny body against his chest, her nose buried in his fur, and he would remain completely still, as if afraid to break her trust. I'd stand in the doorway, the weight of it all pressing into me, the loss that had brought us here, the love that had grown out of it. But not every day was gentle. There were times when exhaustion nearly broke me. Bottle after bottle, hour after hour, my body begged for rest. Some nights I wanted to collapse and let the darkness swallow me. But every time, Titan would be there, his eyes steady, his presence grounding. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. His silent companionship reminded me that I wasn't carrying the burden alone. One morning I woke to chaos, the sound of whining louder than usual. I rushed to the kitchen, panic gripping my chest, only to find the pups scattered in every direction, tails wagging, ears perked. In the middle of it all, Titan stood with a towel in his mouth, dragging it across the floor. The smallest pup had soiled herself, too weak to move, and Titan, my fierce, stoic Doberman, was cleaning up after her. His determination, his refusal to let even the smallest discomfort touch them, broke me in ways words can't reach. It was in moments like that I realized something profound. Titan wasn't just protecting them, he was raising them. The bond between them only deepened as the days rolled on. Their play grew louder, their barks sharper, their tiny teeth stronger. Yet Titan never lost patience. They tugged on his ears, climbed across his back, gnawed on his paws. He let them. He absorbed every ounce of their chaos as though it was his duty to be their world. One evening, as the sky turned violet, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching them tumble through the yard. The smallest one, always bold despite her fragile start, made her way to the edge of the porch steps. She hesitated, her paw dangling in the air. Before I could rise, Titan appeared at her side. He lowered his head, nudging her gently, then stepped onto the grass first. She followed, trusting him more than she trusted the ground beneath her. I felt my throat tighten as I watched. It wasn't just care, it was teaching. Titan was showing her how to live. That night, as I carried the pups back inside, I caught sight of their reflection in the window. 8 small bodies clustered together, one towering figure guarding them. It struck me then that we weren't just surviving anymore. We were building something. Something real. Something that could last. But life, I knew, had a way of testing what it gives. And though we had found balance, though the days had begun to glow with laughter and small victories, a part of me waited for the storm that always comes after peace. And it did. It came not in thunder but in silence, an absence that made my chest ache. One morning, the smallest pup didn't rise with the others. Her breaths, once shallow but determined, had grown quieter through the night. I lifted her, my hands trembling. Titan pressed so close I could feel his breath on my wrist. For hours we sat together, willing her tiny chest to keep moving. I whispered promises. Titan licked her face, nudging her with a patience born of hope. But by nightfall, her fight was gone. The grief that followed was a weight unlike the first. Losing their mother had been a tragedy written by fate, a storm we couldn't outrun. But this loss felt personal, like a piece of me had been carved out, leaving only raw edges behind. I buried her beneath the oak tree, the earth damp beneath my fingers. Titan sat beside me, silent, his head bowed. When I covered her with the last handful of soil, he let out a low, mournful sound. A sound I had never heard from him before. It was grief, pure and unfiltered. For days, the house felt heavier. The pups searched for their sister, their cries sharper, their rest unsettled. Titan watched over them with even greater intensity, as if determined not to let another slip away. And slowly, painfully, we found our rhythm again. Loss had scarred us, but love kept pulling us forward. The first family arrived on a Sunday morning, their laughter spilling into the yard like sunlight. The children knelt in the grass, instantly swarmed by the puppies, their little tails wagging so fast they blurred. I stood on the porch, my hand resting on the railing, feeling pride and dread twist together inside me. This was what we had fought for, their chance at life, at love, at futures filled with warmth. But watching them tumble into new hands was like peeling away pieces of my own heart. Titan stood behind me, silent, his eyes fixed on the scene. He didn't rush forward, didn't growl or protest. Instead, he sat tall, his chest rising and falling slowly, as though he understood in some unspoken way that this was the next chapter. Still, I could feel the weight in him. His ears twitched each time a pup squealed with excitement, his head tilting as though memorizing their voices before they vanished from his care. One by one the families came. The house, once alive with chaos, began to quiet. The food bowls dwindled, the nights softened. The absence grew louder than the noise had ever been. And yet, Titan didn't falter. He walked the empty rooms at first, sniffing corners where the pups had slept, pausing in doorways as if waiting. But then he returned to me, curling at my feet, his steady presence grounding us both. He had given everything, and now he carried the silence with the same dignity he had carried the noise. The last to leave was the smallest, the fragile fighter who had once rested her head on Titan's paw. A couple who had lost their own dog months earlier came to meet her. She clung to Titan until the very end, her tiny body pressed against his chest as though she knew he had been her lifeline. When they finally lifted her into their arms, Titan rose, touched his nose gently to her head, and stepped back. There was no protest, only acceptance, the quiet grace of one who had fulfilled his purpose. That night, the house felt cavernous. I sat on the porch as the crickets sang, the air heavy with memory. Titan lay beside me, his body pressed against my leg. I stroked the curve of his neck, whispering words he didn't need to hear but that I needed to say. "You saved them," I told him. "Every single one. You were their mother when they had none. You were their strength when I was breaking." He tilted his head, his amber eyes catching the light of the porch lamp, steady and calm, and in them I saw not loss but peace. He had given himself to them completely, and in return, they had given him something no one else ever could, the chance to love beyond instinct, to nurture beyond expectation. The pups were gone, but their lives carried his imprint. And though the house was quiet again, it wasn't empty. It carried echoes of the nights we survived, the mornings we laughed, and the bond that had turned grief into something sacred. I leaned into Titan, and together we watched the horizon darken. The world had taken, yes, but it had also given, and in the space between loss and love we had found a family, and that was enough.